Keanu Reeves has always found peace in the sound of the ocean waves. Walking along a lonely beach at sunset, he enjoyed the cool breeze and silence. But in an instant, that peace disappeared. A piercing child's cry tore through the air. His gaze settled on the water. Far from the shore, where she shouldn't have been, a little girl clinging to an air mattress with all her might as the strong current inexorably carried her into the ocean. Without hesitation, Keanu rushed forward. The shore, which just a minute ago seemed like a place of relaxation, has now turned into an arena of struggle for life. No cameras, no fame, just a man, a child, and a moment that would change everything. The sun hung low in the sky, stretching golden beams across the waves as they rolled in, gentle but relentless. The air carried the scent of salt and distant adventure, mingling with the occasional cries of seagulls. Keanu Reeves walked along the shoreline, his bare feet sinking into the damp sand with each step. The rhythmic crash of the ocean soothed him, a stark contrast to the perpetual hum of the city he often escaped. Here, he was just another man seeking solitude. The beach was sparsely populated. A few joggers passed by, lost in their own worlds. A couple strolled hand in hand, their laughter stolen by the wind before it reached him. Further down the shore, a small family played near the water's edge, a mother and her daughter. The little girl, no older than 6, wore a bright yellow swimsuit, her golden curls bouncing as she danced between the waves. Her mother watched, smiling as the child climbed onto an inflatable mattress, kicking at the water, giggling each time the tide rocked her gently. Keanu kept his pace slow, allowing the cool breeze to wash over him. There was something profoundly peaceful about this moment. He had spent years chasing quiet, learning to appreciate it when it arrived, knowing it never stayed for long. The ocean had a way of erasing everything: fame, expectation, the weight of the world. It reminded him of simpler times, childhood days spent floating aimlessly in a sea that didn't judge, that didn't care who he was. A sudden shift in the wind sent a shiver through the air. He watched as the mother glanced away briefly, fumbling with something in her bag. It was only a moment, but sometimes that was all it took. The tide, growing stronger with the shifting breeze, pulled the water just enough to create distance between the shore and the floating mattress. The little girl, unaware, continued to laugh, enjoying the ride. The gap widened inch by inch. The mother looked up, her face instantly draining of color. She rushed to the edge of the water, calling out. Her voice was lost in the vastness of the sea. The girl turned her head, finally noticing the widening distance between her and the shore. Her laughter faltered, replaced by a growing uncertainty. The mattress wobbled, caught in the pull of the ocean, dragging her farther with each second. Keanu's body tensed. He had seen it before, small moments turning into disasters in the blink of an eye. The mother's panic was palpable, her feet splashing in the shallows, but she hesitated. The water was deeper than she expected, the waves growing stronger. Her daughter was no longer within reach. She screamed again, the sound sharp, desperate. Without thinking, Keanu was already moving. The soft sand gave way beneath his sprinting feet, but he didn't slow. The ocean was not forgiving, and the girl was drifting fast. By the time he reached the water, she was farther than she should have been. Her small hands clutched the edges of the inflatable, knuckles white, fear setting in. The water was cold against his skin, but he barely noticed. He pushed forward, strong strokes cutting through the waves as he kept his focus locked on the girl. The distance between them felt immense, growing with each pull of the tide. Every second mattered. His muscles burned, but he propelled himself forward, refusing to let the current dictate the outcome. The girl whimpered, her eyes darting between him and the shore, her voice too weak to rise above the waves. The mattress bobbed precariously, tilting with the movement of the water. One wrong shift, and she would be in the ocean, too small, too fragile against the vast, uncaring sea. Keanu swam harder. The waves, once gentle, now crashed with force, as if trying to push him back. The horizon blurred in his periphery, his world narrowing to the child clinging to her only lifeline. The ocean had taken many things from many people. It would not take her. His fingers finally grasped the edge of the mattress. The girl gasped, wide eyes locking onto his. He steadied it, adjusting his grip, keeping it from flipping as another wave threatened to do just that. His breath came fast, but he spoke with the calm he had perfected over the years. Words didn't matter as much as the steadiness in his expression, the reassurance in his actions. The girl clung tighter, her small body shivering despite the warmth of the setting sun. He could see the fear in her, the overwhelming realization that she had been too far, too alone. Slowly, carefully, he turned the mattress back toward shore. The tide still fought against them, but he was stronger. He kicked with controlled precision, pushing forward, inch by inch. The muscles in his legs burned, his arms heavy, but he didn't slow. On the shore, the mother stood knee-deep in the water, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaking down her face. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some held their phones, filming, but none moved to help. The ocean had a way of making people feel helpless. Keanu didn't stop. He couldn't. His breath grew ragged, his lungs straining, but he kept moving. The girl's weight, the pull of the current, the exhaustion creeping into his limbs, it was all secondary. He had made a choice the moment he stepped into the water, and there was only one way this would end. The waves became shallower, the pull of the tide weakening as he neared the shore. The mother splashed forward, her cries breaking as she reached for her daughter. Keanu guided the mattress in, letting the mother grasp her child, pulling her into trembling arms. The girl sobbed, clinging to her mother, burying her face into the only safety she knew. Keanu stayed in the water for a moment longer, catching his breath, letting the exhaustion settle into his bones. He turned his gaze to the ocean, watching as it returned to its usual rhythm, as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't just tried to claim another soul. When he finally stepped back onto the shore, the weight of the moment hit him fully. The mother turned to him, gratitude pouring from her in ways words couldn't capture. The crowd murmured, realizing who he was, but for once, the recognition didn't matter. This wasn't about him. The child was safe. That was all that mattered. And as Keanu looked back at the vast, endless sea, he knew he had been exactly where he was meant to be. Keanu stood ankle-deep in the water, his breath still uneven, his muscles burning from the relentless fight against the ocean. The moment stretched longer than it should have, the world narrowing down to the quiet gasps of the mother holding her daughter, the hushed murmurs of the crowd, and the rhythmic crashing of the waves behind him. The girl clung to her mother, sobbing in her shoulder, her tiny fingers grasping the fabric of her mother's shirt as if afraid that the ocean might try to take her again. The woman was trembling, whispering frantic reassurances into her daughter's damp curls, but her voice broke under the weight of relief. Keanu exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he finally stepped away from the water, feeling the resistance of wet fabric clinging to his skin. The air was thick with salt, and the lingering adrenaline still pulsing through his veins. The crowd that had formed stood in stunned silence, many still gripping their phones, unsure whether to applaud or simply absorb what had just happened. Someone whispered his name, and the ripple of recognition moved through the small gathering. But for once, the usual excitement of seeing a celebrity was overshadowed by something deeper. This wasn't about Hollywood. This wasn't about fame. This was raw, human survival. The mother turned toward him, her face streaked with tears. Her lips parted, searching for words, but all she managed was a choked sob before shaking her head, overwhelmed. She reached out, her hand trembling, before pulling it back to hold her daughter tighter, as if the child's warmth was the only thing keeping her grounded. Keanu gave her a small nod, his own breath evening out, his heartbeat still hammering in his chest. "She's safe now," he said, voice hoarse from the exertion. The woman nodded rapidly, pressing kisses into her daughter's wet hair, her whole body shaking. Finally, she looked up again, eyes wide with gratitude. She started, but her voice cracked, unable to complete the sentence. Instead, she did the only thing she could. She mouthed, "Thank you." Keanu only nodded once more. He didn't need words. A few bystanders finally broke out of their trance, stepping forward, offering towels and water. Someone draped a blanket over the mother and child. Another person hesitated before stepping toward Keanu, handing him a towel. He accepted it without thinking, wiping the salt water from his face, blinking against the sting in his eyes. The mother sank to her knees in the sand, pulling her daughter into her lap, rocking her gently as her sobs turned into quiet hiccups. It was only now that the child's wide, frightened eyes found Keanu again. She studied him, as if trying to understand what had happened, as if trying to reconcile the fear she had felt with the safety she now clung to. Her small voice broke the silence. "You saved me." The words were soft, fragile, but they landed with a weight Keanu hadn't been expecting. He crouched down slowly, careful not to overwhelm her, meeting her at eye level. "You were really brave," he said, voice low but steady. The girl sniffled, rubbing at her eyes with tiny fists, her fingers still trembling. "The ocean was big," she murmured, as if the realization had only just settled in. "It was," Keanu agreed, "but you held on." She nodded slowly, as if deciding that his words made sense. Then, without warning, she lunged forward and wrapped her small arms around his neck, pressing her damp face against his shoulder. Keanu stiffened for a fraction of a second before his body relaxed into the embrace. He wasn't sure when the last time was that someone had held on to him like this, with no expectations, no ulterior motive, just pure, unfiltered gratitude and trust. He closed his eyes briefly, his own breath evening out as he gently placed a steadying hand on her back. The moment lasted only a few seconds before she pulled away, but something unspoken lingered between them. The mother wiped her eyes again, exhaling shakily. "I don't know how to thank you," she finally managed, her voice thick with emotion. Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to." The woman's lip trembled. "I was right there. I should have." "You did everything you could," Keanu interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "The ocean is unpredictable. It happens fast." She inhaled sharply, nodding, but the guilt still lingered in her expression. Keanu knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror before. The weight of feeling powerless, of believing that somehow you should have done more. One of the bystanders finally spoke. "You're a hero." Keanu tensed slightly. The word made his stomach twist. He wasn't a hero. He had done what anyone should do. He had seen a child in danger, and he had acted. That was all. But the murmurs around him grew, the realization of what had happened spreading through the small crowd. His name was whispered over and over, the moment turning from something intimate to something that felt overwhelming. A man stepped forward, holding up his phone. "Dude, that was insane. I got the whole thing on video." Keanu's jaw tightened. He had spent years avoiding the chaos of media attention, carving out spaces where he could just be. But now, this moment, the raw, human moment, was about to be packaged, dissected, and turned into headlines. Before he could respond, the mother stood up abruptly, shielding her daughter, her expression shifting from gratitude to something fiercely protective. "He just saved my child's life," she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the growing noise. "He doesn't owe you a performance." Silence. The man lowered his phone slightly, guilt flashing across his face. Other spectators shuffled awkwardly, as if suddenly realizing they had intruded on something sacred. Keanu exhaled slowly. He appreciated her words, more than she probably knew. He met her gaze, offering a small nod of gratitude. The woman turned back to him, her expression softening. Is there any way I can repay you?" Keanu looked at the little girl, her small hand now gripping her mother's tightly. "Just take care of her," he said simply. "That's all that matters." The woman nodded, swallowing hard. "I will." The ocean continued its eternal rhythm behind them, uncaring of the moment it had created. The tide had taken what it wanted, tested the strength of those who dared to challenge it. And now, it receded, as if content with what had transpired. Keanu glanced at the horizon one last time before turning away. He didn't need the attention, the recognition, or the inevitable headlines. He just needed to know that the girl was safe. And in the end, that was enough. The night had settled over the beach by the time Keanu finally left the shoreline. The ocean no longer raged. It had returned to its usual rhythmic tranquility, as if indifferent to the events of the day. The world around him was quiet now, the crowd having slowly dispersed, leaving only the sound of distant waves and the occasional gust of wind stirring the sand. Keanu's clothes clung to his skin, damp and heavy from the seawater. His muscles ached from the swim, a deep exhaustion settling into his bones. But his mind refused to slow down. He had saved a child today. The weight of that reality pressed against him, not as a burden, but as something else entirely, something he wasn't quite sure how to define. As he walked back toward the street, away from the fading murmurs of bystanders, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He hesitated before pulling it out, already anticipating what he would see. And he was right. Notifications flooded his screen. Calls, messages, articles being shared at an alarming speed. He didn't have to read them to know what they said. Hollywood star Keanu Reeves rescues child from raging ocean. Real-life action hero. Keanu saves the day. Keanu Reeves proves yet again why he's the most humble star in Hollywood. He exhaled slowly, locking his phone and slipping it back into his pocket. He had never done things for recognition. He had simply acted, because that's what a human being should do. But now, the world had latched onto the moment, turning it into a spectacle, a story to be consumed, dissected, and debated. Keanu reached his car and leaned against it for a moment, closing his eyes. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind something else, something quieter, heavier. His mind replayed the scene over and over. The fear in the little girl's eyes, the desperation in her mother's voice, the force of the waves trying to pull them apart. He had felt powerless before. He had lost people to battles he couldn't fight, to time he couldn't outrun. But today, for once, he had been fast enough, strong enough. He had changed the ending. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. The drive home was silent, the city lights blurring past the windows. Keanu barely noticed when he pulled into his driveway, stepping out into the cool night air. His home was exactly as he had left it, calm, undisturbed, a stark contrast to the chaos the world had attached to his name. Inside, he peeled off his wet shirt and tossed it into the hamper before running a towel through his damp hair. He caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror. Tired eyes, salt-dried skin, and an expression he couldn't quite place. He had spent years mastering the art of quiet solitude, of existing without making waves. And yet, today, he had plunged headfirst into the ocean, and the world had followed. A sharp knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting visitors. He sighed, running a hand through his hair before making his way to the entrance. When he opened the door, he found himself staring into the same pair of eyes that had haunted him all evening. The mother stood before him, her daughter gripping her hand tightly. "Hi," she said, voice tentative. I wasn't sure if I should come, but I needed to say thank you. Properly." Keanu blinked, momentarily thrown off by her presence. He had assumed their paths had diverged after the rescue, each of them going back to their lives, the moment becoming just another memory. But now, standing before him, the mother looked as though she was carrying more weight than gratitude alone. "Come in," he said after a moment, stepping aside. She hesitated before nodding, guiding her daughter into the house. The little girl's eyes darted around, taking in the space with quiet curiosity. She still held on her mother's hand, her grip tight, as if afraid of letting go. "I'm sorry to intrude," the woman said, rubbing the back of her neck. "I know you probably want to put all of this behind you, but I couldn't just leave things like that." Keanu shook his head. "You don't have to apologize." He glanced down at the girl, offering her a small smile. "How are you holding up?" She didn't answer right away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her mother's sleeve. "The ocean was scary," she murmured. Keanu crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "Yeah, it can be." The girl hesitated, then took a small step forward. "You weren't scared?" Keanu's smile was faint. "I was, but I had to make sure you were safe first." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand how that could be possible. Then, to his surprise, she let go of her mother's hand and hugged him. A small, trembling embrace, but one filled with so much trust that it nearly made his breath hitch. Keanu gently placed a hand on her back, steadying her, grounding them both. The mother watched, eyes glistening, before exhaling softly. "I don't know how to repay you," she admitted. "I don't even know where to start." Keanu stood, shaking his head. "There's nothing to repay." She swallowed hard, looking away. "I keep thinking about what could have happened. If you hadn't been there," her voice broke slightly, "I wouldn't have been able to reach her in time." Keanu exhaled slowly. "You were there. That's what matters." She let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. "I froze. I was right there, and I froze." Keanu met her gaze. "Because you're human. Fear does that. It doesn't make you weak." She looked at him, then really looked at him, as if seeing something she hadn't before. "You don't just say things to make people feel better, do you?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "No. I say things that I believe." A silence stretched between them, not awkward, but full. The little girl still stood close to him, as if some part of her felt safer there. Finally, the mother reached into her bag, pulling out a small notebook. "My daughter wanted to draw something for you," she said, handing it over. Keanu took it carefully, flipping it open. Inside was a crayon drawing of a man with dark hair swimming toward a tiny girl on an inflatable mattress. The ocean was vast, looming, but the man was reaching out, breaking through the waves. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. The little girl peeked up at him. "That's you," she whispered. Keanu smiled, running his fingers gently over the page. "I see that. It's really good." The girl beamed, proud. The mother exhaled. "I didn't even know she remembered that much detail. But she's been talking about you ever since." Keanu closed the notebook, holding it carefully. "Tell her she's a great artist." The woman gave him a small, knowing smile. "She'll like hearing that." Keanu met her gaze, offering a nod. "Take care of each other." "We will," she promised. As they left, the little girl turned at the last second, waving before disappearing into the night with her mother. Keanu stood in the doorway for a long moment, the crayon drawing still in his hands. He didn't believe in fate, but sometimes, just sometimes, he believed in the right people finding each other at the right time. And maybe that was enough. The night had settled into a hush, but Keanu's mind refused to quiet. The warmth of the little girl's embrace still lingered on his skin, her whispered words echoing through his thoughts. He sat at his dining table, staring at the crayon drawing she had given him, his fingers brushing lightly over the uneven texture of the paper. The child's small hands had sketched an image of him breaking through the ocean waves, reaching for her. Simple, innocent, but carrying a weight he couldn't quite explain. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The ocean had always been a source of peace for him, a reminder of the vastness of the world, of things far greater than himself. But tonight, it carried another meaning, one that tethered him to that moment, to that child's fear, to the unspoken gratitude in her mother's eyes. He had never sought to be anyone's hero, yet here he was, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted in his life, even if he didn't yet know how. He reached for his phone, hesitating before unlocking the screen. The media storm had only grown. His name was everywhere, articles dissecting his actions, headlines hailing him as a real-life superhero. Videos of the rescue were circulating, strangers analyzing his every movement. Some called it bravery. Others romanticized the act, turning it into a Hollywood narrative. But to Keanu, it had simply been instinct, a moment of decision, a human choice. A message from an unknown number appeared on his screen. His brows furrowed as he opened it. "Thank you for today. I don't know if I'll ever find the right words, but I needed you to know that you saved more than just my daughter's life. Asterisk asterisk." The sender's name wasn't displayed, but he knew immediately who it was. Sophia, the girl's mother. He stared at the message for a long moment before typing a simple response. "She's a strong kid. You did everything you could." Asterisk asterisk. A few minutes passed before another reply came. "I don't know if I believe that, but I'm trying." Asterisk asterisk. Keanu ran a hand over his face. He knew the weight of guilt, the way it burrowed deep and whispered what-ifs. He had carried it himself, long ago. He thought of replying again, offering more reassurance, but something told him she needed space to process this on her own. Instead, he put his phone down and turned back to the drawing. He wasn't sure why, but he carefully pinned it to the corkboard near his kitchen. A reminder, perhaps, not of heroism, but of something simpler, of the way lives intertwined in unexpected ways, of the ripples left behind by small moments. The next morning, Keanu found himself back at the beach. It wasn't intentional. At least, that's what he told himself. His feet had carried him here before he'd fully realized where he was headed. The sand was still cool beneath his bare feet, the early morning tide lapping gently at the shore. It was quiet, save for the distant cries of seagulls and the rhythmic rush of waves. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the salt air. The ocean, indifferent as always, continued its endless dance. It had almost taken a life yesterday, and yet, today, it greeted him the same way it always had. Back so soon? The voice pulled him from his thoughts. Turning, he found Sophia standing a few feet away, hands tucked into the sleeves of an oversized sweater. Her hair was wind-tousled, her eyes searching. Keanu nodded slightly. Guess so. She glanced toward the water, then back at him. I wasn't expecting to see you here. Neither was I, he admitted. A faint smile touched her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was still exhaustion there, a quiet kind of grief that had nothing to do with loss, but with the weight of what could have been. They stood in silence for a moment before she spoke again. Emma's still asleep. She had nightmares last night. Keanu's chest tightened. That's normal after something like that. Sophia nodded, shifting her weight on the sand. She kept asking if you were okay. He was surprised by that. Me? She told me she dreamed about you still being in the water, she said softly. That you didn't make it back. Keanu looked toward the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly, indifferent to the fears it had ignited. I made it back. I know, she said, voice barely above a whisper. But she was scared, and I think, she hesitated, then sighed. I think I was too. He turned back to her, studying the tension in her features. She wasn't just talking about last night. She was talking about the guilt, the helplessness, the self-doubt that lingered after moments like these. You're not supposed to be fearless, Keanu said after a pause. You're supposed to be human. Sophia let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You make it sound so simple. It's not, he admitted, but it's the truth. She exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly, as if some of the weight had eased. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she looked down at the sand and kicked at a seashell near her foot. I don't want this to be the only way Emma remembers the ocean, she murmured. Keanu understood. Fear had a way of sinking deep, of turning something beautiful into something to be avoided. Then let's change that, he said. Sophia blinked, looking up at him. What? Come back, he said simply. Not today. Not tomorrow. But when she's ready. Let her see the ocean as something more than what happened. She studied him, as if trying to gauge whether he really meant it. You think it's that easy? No, Keanu said. But I think it's worth trying. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then slowly she nodded. Okay. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of salt and sun-warmed sand. Sophia took a deep breath, as if steeling herself, before meeting his gaze again. Would you be there? Keanu didn't hesitate. Yeah. A small, tired smile played on her lips. Okay. He nodded, and without another word, she turned and started walking back toward the street, leaving footprints in the damp sand. He watched her go, then turned back to the water. The ocean continued its endless rhythm, but now it felt different. Maybe it wasn't just a place of loss. Maybe it was a place of second chances, too. The days following the rescue had been a whirlwind of media coverage, praise, and endless stories dissecting every moment of Keanu's act of heroism. News outlets played the footage repeatedly, clips showing him sprinting into the water, fighting against the waves, and pulling the child to safety. Social media exploded with messages of admiration, people lauding him as a real-life hero, the kind Hollywood could only dream of writing into a script. But Keanu wanted none of it. He had spent years cultivating a quiet existence outside of fame's spotlight, carving out a life where he could simply be. This wasn't a role he had played. This wasn't a scripted act. It had been instinct, pure and simple. A choice he had made in an instant, without thought, because that's what people should do when they see someone in danger. He didn't need recognition, nor did he want it. Yet, the world had other plans. The calls poured in. Reporters, journalists, talk show hosts, all eager to hear his side of the story, to put his name on their screens and their headlines. Even people within the industry, directors and producers he had worked with over the years, reached out congratulating him, offering him roles that played on the very act he had performed in real life. He ignored them all. What mattered was that the little girl was safe, that her mother could hold her without fear, that they could move forward knowing the worst had been avoided. That was enough, or at least it should have been. One evening, after another long day of dodging calls and declining interviews, Keanu found himself standing on his balcony, looking out at the city sprawled before him. The hum of Los Angeles was ever-present, distant yet inescapable. A cool breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of rain that had yet to fall. His mind drifted back to that day at the beach. The way the little girl had clung to the inflatable, her knuckles white with fear. The desperate cries of her mother, the sheer panic in her voice. The weight of the water dragging at him, fighting him every inch of the way. He hadn't realized how much the moment had imprinted on him. Not just the physical toll, but the emotional one. He had seen fear before, had experienced it in ways most people never would. But this had been different. It had been real in a way that nothing else was. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. With a sigh, he pushed himself away from the balcony and crossed the room, pulling open the door. Sophia stood there, the mother of the little girl he had saved. He blinked, surprised to see her. They had spoken briefly after the incident, exchanged words of gratitude, but he hadn't expected to see her again. She looked uncertain, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure whether she should have come. I hope I'm not bothering you," she said, shifting slightly. I needed to talk to you." Keanu stepped aside. "Come in." She entered slowly, glancing around as if taking in the space, absorbing the quiet that filled it. "I'm sorry," she said again, wringing her hands. "I know you probably want to put all of this behind you, but I couldn't stop thinking about everything. And I needed to see you." He motioned for her to sit, taking a seat across from her. "You don't have to apologize." She exhaled shakily. "I haven't been able to sleep since that day. Every time I close my eyes, I see her in the water. I hear her calling for me, and she swallowed hard, closing her eyes for a brief moment before continuing. "I know she's safe. I know that. But the fear, it hasn't left me." Keanu understood that. Fear had a way of lingering, of embedding itself in the cracks of a person's mind, refusing to let go. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't been there," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "How different everything would be." "You were there," Keanu said. "That's what matters." She let out a soft, bitter laugh. "I froze. You were afraid." She looked at him then, eyes searching. "How did you do it? How did you not freeze?" Keanu was quiet for a moment, considering his words. "I didn't think. I just moved." She nodded slowly, as if trying to understand, trying to grasp how someone could act without hesitation when faced with something so terrifying. A beat of silence stretched between them before she spoke again. "Emma keeps asking about you." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Emma?" She smiled faintly. "My daughter." He hadn't known her name. Somehow, knowing it now made the memory of that day even more vivid. "She's been drawing pictures of you," Sophia continued, pulling a small notebook from her bag. She flipped it open, revealing a page filled with crayon lines, a sketch of a man with dark hair, standing in the ocean, his arms stretched toward a tiny figure on a floating mattress. The waves were big, looming, but the man was reaching, unwavering. Keanu traced his fingers over the page, something tight forming in his chest. "She says you're her hero." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I'm not a hero." Sophia's gaze softened. "Maybe not to yourself, but to her? You always will be." Keanu swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had spent so much of his life avoiding being seen as anything other than just a man, just someone living his life, doing what felt right. But Emma had given him a place in her world, a version of himself that he hadn't quite known existed. He closed the notebook gently, looking up at Sophia. Tell her she's a great artist. Sophia smiled, nodding. She'll love that. They sat in silence for a while, neither needing to fill the space with unnecessary words. There was an understanding between them, something unspoken but deeply felt. Finally, Sophia stood. I just needed you to know how much that day meant. Not just to her, but to me. To both of us. Keanu nodded. I'm glad she's okay. She is. Because of you. She hesitated before offering one last small smile, then turned toward the door. As she reached for the handle, she glanced back. You may not think of yourself as a hero, but sometimes it doesn't matter what we believe about ourselves. It matters what we do. And with that, she was gone. Keanu sat there for a long time, the notebook still in his hands, the weight of her words settling over him. He wasn't a hero, but maybe, just maybe, he had done something that truly mattered, and that he could live with,